Can environmental regulators protect us from forever chemicals? They're believed to cause life-threatening diseases, and in the U.S., the Environmental Protection Agency has finally put strict limits on toxic PFAS in drinking water. But with an estimated 200 million Americans affected, will municipalities be able to effectively test and control the toxins? I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's Newsmaker is the PFAS water crisis. Well, the EPA has a new plan to tackle industrial toxins found in public water supplies. So-called forever chemicals, or PFAS, are believed to have caused thousands of cases of cancer and severe health complications nationwide. Under the EPA's new rules, of the more than 9,000 PFAS compounds, 6 will now require monitoring by municipal water systems. Now, the Biden administration has allocated $10 billion to help communities deal with the crisis. The funding from the bipartisan infrastructure law will ensure PFAS are brought down to the lowest levels that tests can detect. The EPA estimates it will reduce exposure for nearly 100 million Americans. Now, it's important to note that this is a global problem and one that the EU is also determined to fix. The bloc is proposing a ban on the entire class of chemicals, not just certain compounds, starting in 2026. So what exactly are PFAS, and how did they become so pervasive in our environment and our bodies?
They are substances that represent a group of more than 9,000 chemicals and have been in use since the 1940s. PFAS are made by humans to have physical properties that make them resistant to water and stains. The company DuPont introduced the nonstick cookware coated with the chemical Teflon in 1946. It's been taken off the market, but other brands are being made with new PFAS. These chemicals are everywhere. They can be found in thousands of products we use every day, like rugs, furniture, textiles, fast food packaging, the firefighting foam, and even the makeup we wear. People are exposed through consumer products or situations where the chemicals have contaminated public water supply. It's hard for the industry to get rid of forever chemicals. They stop using one of them when they figure out it's bad, but they just pick up another one, and the cycle continues.
It's the resilient and durable qualities that make these chemicals so useful in everyday life, but it's also what makes them particularly harmful to people in the environment. What began as a so-called miracle, groundbreaking technology meant for practicality and convenience, quickly devolved into one of the most pressing environmental and public health concerns in the modern world.
Now, while millions of us may not have safe drinking water, millions of others face the prospect of no water at all. Access to water is a huge problem across the world. The UN estimates the number of people in cities facing water scarcity will nearly double from 930 million in 2016 to 2.4 billion by 2050. Now, the climate crisis is putting severe pressure on water resources. Already 10% of the global population live in countries with high or critical water stress. It's a crisis that could spiral out of control, and the UN is calling for international cooperation to address the problem.
The global crisis requires global cooperation. The Security Council must take up the issue of water scarcity, especially because we know that water scarcity exacerbates conflict and disrupts peace and security. Without water, there cannot be food. There cannot be peace. There cannot be life. We must build a future where safe water flows freely to all. In so many places, water scarcity has gotten even more extreme, especially in conflict zones and locales hardest hit by the climate crisis. We really are headed in the wrong direction.
So whether it's a lack of access or contamination, the world is facing multiple water crises. But can it get better? Joining me now to debate that are from Perugia, Italy, Richard Connor. He's a UNESCO expert on water resources and editor of the World Water Development Report. From Blacksburg, Virginia, Dr. Marc Edwards is a professor of environmental and water resources engineering at Virginia Tech University. And from New Delhi, Anil Sood is the president of CHETNA, an NGO focused on environmental pollution. Thanks all so much for being with us. Let's begin with the PFAS regulation then in the U.S. I mean, the EPA has now identified 6 compounds to monitor in drinking water. When we know that there are actually thousands of compounds, all of which are potentially dangerous, Richard Connor, let me ask you, do you think the EPA is doing enough?
I don't know if they're doing everything they can. Um, it comes down to environmental regulation. It's not so much, what municipalities can do to purify the water. It has to do with the quality of the source water in the first place. So, is the EPA protecting the environment from which the water comes from to the extent that they could or should? That's a question open for debate, and that leads to the question: how can you protect the environment, preventing these chemicals from coming into the environment so they end up in the water supply in the first place? I think that's the big question. How much can the EPA actually do to promote environmental protection?
Okay, so Marc Edwards, I'd like to get your thoughts on that. I mean, are we barking up the wrong tree by looking at regulators to help protect us here from this kind of contamination, or is that really the only authority we could rely on in the first place?
I think the system is working. We're always identifying new health threats and trying to determine how to deal with them. And PFAS is the most recent example amongst many. We identified this chemical. We've done occurrence studies. We've learned how to treat it. So now is the appropriate time to move to regulation, do cost-benefit analysis, and figure out how to proceed.
Let me ask you, though, when we hear that the European Union wants to ban the entire class of chemicals, notice PFAS, I mean, and then we hear about the U.S. looking at 6 compounds only, that discrepancy is huge. Is there something we're not understanding here, or is it that the EU is trying to do something much more, even though it might be much more difficult, than U.S. regulators are after?
No, I think the two approaches are compatible. We have to focus on what we can measure, and so eventually the two approaches might very well converge down the road.
Okay. Who, though, is going to do this monitoring, actually? And who's going to be held responsible if PFAS are found? Should taxpayers have to fund water cleanup when chemical companies like DuPont or Dow have been dumping them for so long?
Well, there's no doubt we'll find them. Water utilities will have to monitor under the new EPA regulations, and we'll have to figure out how to pay for it. Ultimately, the cost is usually borne by the ratepayers, although sometimes industry is forced to pay in as well.
And of course, in some cases, the military might be found responsible. So if the military is held financially liable, that will come from the taxpayer pocket anyway.
Exactly.
Yeah. Anil, let me ask you, I mean, you're working in the Indian context, and there are any number of environmental issues facing Indians right now. PFAS contamination is among them. Some steps have been taken to adopt the International Standards Organization's benchmarks. Have you seen any real change, though? Are they doing the work required?
No,
No.
it's only on paper, and it's only a publicity gimmick, if I can say very frankly. On ground, nothing is happening. Rather, water quality has gone from bad to worse. I'll just share with you one small example. Back in 80s, a small channel used to flow through our ancestral home. I could drink water straight from that channel. That water was used for almost every household purpose, be it cooking, be it bathing. People were scared of, spoiling or contaminating that particular channel. Those channels disappeared. Piped water started coming. As per one report, out of 179 countries, India is at 139th place in terms of water purity, which is hardly 18%. So it's shocking. The contamination by industry even the rivers have been polluted to such an extent that it is becoming difficult to revive those rivers. And government is the biggest polluter apart from industry.
Yeah, and Anil, I have to ask this. I mean, are we then expecting too much, from the planet and from engineers working on this planet when we want to, if we're looking in the context of India with one of the biggest populations on the planet and one of the highest population densities, we
Yes.
want to continually grow our population.
Yeah.
We're looking at 10 billion in the not too distant future. And we want to
Yeah.
continue consuming, the way we do, which constantly stresses and stretches all of our resources. Are we just
Yes.
becoming, particularly when you see the Indian context, is it all just becoming unsustainable?
Uh, we are, as it is, heading for disaster. We are already at a stage where it is much beyond unsustainable growth. Convenience has taken precedence over the environment. Cherrapunji was the world's highest place having rainfall. Today, Cherrapunji is bereft of rainfall. Now, in that particular part of the country, people travel 5 to 10 kilometers to get piped water supply. Can you imagine that? It's happening at a place which had world's highest rainfall and which had, continuous source of water. There is no water. We have stretched beyond our capacity, and the population also has gone beyond sustainable levels. And again, exploitation is much more than recharging.
Right. Let me turn to Richard
So
for your comments on the same question, because you've seen the global issues involving water. It's not just the contamination, it's also the water scarcity. And Richard, we keep expecting to be able to grow our populations and continue our consumption, but somehow we want our water supplies more secure, cleaner. Can it be done?
I think so. I honestly don't think that it's the population growth that is unsustainable. I think it's consumption patterns that are unsustainable. Um, we were just talking about environmental water scarcity, but what we need to look at is, and what we were talking about earlier was economic water scarcity, which is the water is there. There's a lot. It's coming down. There's a lot of precipitation in certain areas, but the people are not getting services, and so it's not a lack of water. It's not a lack of the resources. It's a lack of investment in infrastructure and to bring water services to people. And in terms of consumption, it's the globally, it's the richest people, the richest 10% or what have you, that use the vast majority of resources. So it's not really population growth. Population growth is happening much more in developing countries, primarily in cities, where you have a large, high concentrations of people. So you can actually, it's if with the proper investment and political will to do so, it is possible to bring water supply to the vast majority of people that don't have it.
Okay. Mark, would you agree there? I mean, especially, the population may be sustainable, a growing population may be sustainable, but the consumption, our consumption behavior is not.
That's certainly part of the equation. The history of human civilization is we create problems and identify them and ultimately solve them. And I think we're moving in that direction.
Let me ask you then, Mark, specifically about, the packaging. When we talk about our consumption, the packaging containing PFAS. You now have 6 states in the US that have already banned PFAS in food packaging, but the EPA hasn't looked at that. We also, remember when we dispose, we have to remember when we dispose of the packaging, it ends up back basically in our water supply. So how can we get that under control? It's another huge element. It's not really being measured in these drinking water issues that the EPA seems to be addressing, but it's still there haunting us terribly, not just in the water, but the food we consume.
Oh, sure, it's part of the equation. If you look at our prior examples of how we dealt with the depleting ozone layer and chlorofluorocarbons, it's a long process where you have to find substitute materials, products that are causing the problem. Then you have to wait for them to naturally attenuate in the environment and or try to remove them. So we have prior examples where we were successful. It takes decades to find substitute products and to take the steps we need to protect ourselves and the environment.
Right. It's interesting you mentioned chlorofluorocarbons because that did require a huge amount of consumer adjustment. So when it comes to PFAS, what should consumers be prepared for then as far as adjusting our consumer behavior? Because there are so many products that we feel particularly dependent on, whether it's Teflon and cooking materials that we've used for decades and rainproof water jackets that we want to wear, umbrellas we want to use. What are going to be these kinds of alternatives for products that we've become so accustomed to?
Well, industry will respond. We survived without these products for a large part of our time on this planet, and we can find substitutes that hopefully have lesser adverse impacts. But it starts by identifying a problem and then creating consumer demand for goods that don't have them, or creating regulation that ultimately does ban them or forces the industry to be responsible for the cleanup costs.
Anil, what's your take on that, especially again in the Indian context where you are? Do you feel sometimes that consumers are willing to take a risk with their health in order to maintain certain conveniences that we have become accustomed to?
See, I still remember the time when I used to go to the market with cloth bag. No plastic, no products wrapped in, fancy packaging. In shopping malls, you see today, most of the vegetables are packed, wrapped in plastic. You go to this ready-made garment shops, you find everything wrapped in plastic. You know, we have to start thinking of refusing, recycle, and reuse. Unless we adopt these three R's in principle, I don't think we can change. We'll have to start refusing to accept anything which is packed in plastic. Now, the interesting part, the beauty products, which are, very often advertised on media with beautiful looking ladies and handsome boys, those beauty products also have plastic, those small grains, which are called scrubbers. Those also find place, those find place in water contamination. What are we doing? What are we thinking? So we'll have to, times have come that we'll have to start thinking very seriously about all these products. And you see, there was a time in US also, I used to, take tap water anywhere and everywhere in 2000, till 2016. But today I'm scared.
Mm.
US being a rich country, US having all resources, if US is facing this, and again, let me tell you one thing very frankly, these catchy advertisement regarding this plastic cups, plastic mugs, and all throw single-use plastic. These are all, whatever you may say, that single-use plastic is banned. Still, nobody can certify whether the plastic is recyclable or single-use
Okay, but isn't there a
because
step
there is
missing
no
here, though,
enforcement.
Anil? I mean, I know you're not, I don't think you're an economist, but what about the businesses that rely on the
See,
economy of
again,
those
I'm
single-use?
coming to this.
Right. Okay. I mean,
See,
that's going to be a
I'm
huge shift. It's so cheap, and consumers have come to expect cheaper goods.
see what is the cost? What is the cost? Environmental cost is no see, it's not so cheap. Your health or
Okay.
my health is not so cheap. We'll have to understand that. You see, there was a time invest. We are talking of investment. We have spoiled the nature. We have contaminated the waters. We'll have to stop doing it. Unless we stop contaminating water, investment is going to be huge, which I don't think anybody can have that kind of investment first to contaminate the water and then clean the water.
Right. I mean,
Recently, somebody came to me.
yeah.
Somebody came to me recently that we can use seawater. We can desalinate seawater and we can use it. I said, okay, in coastal areas you may be able to supply 5%. What about costs? What about the brine which is left over? What about power consumption? You see, you
Mm,
have to look at holistically from all angles. It's not one side only.
right.
The
Uh,
moment we start calculating cost benefit analysis, I don't think we can attribute any cost to the environment.
okay. Let me get Richard's take then. I mean, do you think consumers worldwide can adjust to what needs to be done and that the economy can adjust to potentially much more expensive kind of packaging materials, business resources that they need in order to create a cleaner environment that actually makes us healthier and would seem to be a win-win, but it's going to cost.
Yeah, I'm not an economist either, but I'm under the impression that it wouldn't necessarily be that much more expensive. It's true, the cost benefit analysis, you look at health impacts, environmental impacts, all related, and in the end, it does end up costing us a lot more. But if you look at just in terms of environmental compliance, you're talking about microbeads, for instance. So these microplastics that you have it in toothpaste. These things are all over the place and they're bioaccumulating. There's all kinds of examples. When you mentioned, different international chemical companies, chemical development companies, what I don't see is some sort of environmental compliance in the product development phase. So, imagine if we had laws, and maybe they exist, but I'm not aware of them, that when you ask for a patent on something like a type of plastic or some sort of a type of Teflon or something like that, that the patent could be attributed with respect to the potential environmental impacts, which I think you could probably have an idea of how quickly or slowly it will degrade. But then degrade into what? Will it act as an endocrine, a
Right.
receptor
But I mean, is the
blocker,
problem there
or
that,
these things?
legislation always lags behind technology? We develop these things, we really
Uh,
don't know how they're going to pan out, and then the laws have to be made after the
I
fact.
think biochemical knowledge is strong enough
Mm,
because it's not like new compounds. It's different types of very similar compounds. So, you're comparing the US was identifying 6 and the EU identifying 1,000 or so, but they're very quite similar chemically. And so the impact, that's probably why the EU just went with a broad stroke because they're very similar compounds.
okay, glad you
And
explained that.
taking, of course, yeah.
Yeah, because I mean, I've seen people complain about, wait, why are they only identifying 6? There are so many, it's only going to work if we take them all out. But that's interesting to know that they all are similar enough that they could be detected in the same way and taken out. But Mark, let me come back to you. We're down to our last few minutes. When it comes to water, especially PFAS contaminating water supplies where you are, particularly in the United States, what are the alternatives right now? Because it's going to take some time to sort this out. I mean, when we look at bottled water, is that a better alternative? I mean, is it actually safer? Because we're hearing that those are contaminated with microplastics that could be equally hazardous to our health.
Right, all water has risks. Even bottled water has, contaminants in it and sometimes biological activity. Generally speaking, water from the tap in the United States is safe. Engineers do a great job providing a near reagent grade quality product for pennies per ton. The issue is the exceptions to that, and that comes from not investing in water infrastructure on the one hand, and a few examples where government agencies betrayed the public trust and told them their water was safe when it wasn't. I think consumers are generally accepting of the idea that if they're told the water has certain contaminants and how to deal with it, whether it's point of use filters or bottled water, they can make those decisions. and not lose faith in the entire system, as we've seen in a few examples in the U.S., such as in the case of Flint, Michigan.
Yeah. Do you think the U.S. can sort this out?
I'm very hopeful because the alternative is too worrisome to accept.
Indeed. Okay, Marc, that will have to be the final word. I'd like to thank all three of my panelists so much for being with us on this edition of The Newsmakers, and our viewers, of course, for joining us as well. Remember, you can follow us on Twitter, and do be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey. We'll see you next time.